Hello, everybody. Hope as everyone's popping on here, just want to welcome you all to Changing Lanes Recovery and Support Group. We are up in northern British Columbia, but you may be joining us from here in Fort St. John or some of the other places along the way. So I know there's some joining us from New Brunswick and southern BC, in Pond Inlets, Alexandria, Colorado. I just want to welcome everybody. Maybe Saskatchewan, and wherever you are coming from, we just want to welcome you. And this is a faith-based recovery group, and so we are thankful that despite the circumstances that are happening, we can still get together and be an encouragement to one another. We don't want anyone to feel like they're alone, and we want to still be able to join together, so I'm thankful that we can. So as people start to pop up, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Darlene, and I'm a believer in the power of Jesus Christ, but I do still struggle. I'm still human, and I have a lot of struggles, and the Lord is helping me through a process, a very identifiable process of recovery to overcome those things. I just also want to say before we get started that we have been praying for you folks down south, that the cities and the states where the storms have been passing through. It's very devastating to see some of the things that have happened and the loss that has occurred. So you are definitely in our prayers. And if there's any specific requests, please let us know and we will pray for you and your families. So I would like to talk tonight a little bit about this disease, this destructive force that's being carried around by those who don't even know that they are carrying it. It does affect others who they're coming in contact with, and in some cases it's ending up with some very devastating results. You know, we're hearing about it, we're speculating about it, and for the most part, some people are trying to avoid it because they don't understand it. Like, what is it? Who has it? What are the effects of it? Am I in danger of its clutches? And you know, by that description, you might think that I'm talking about this whole COVID-19, but I'm not. I'm actually talking about what I like to talk about just a little bit today is about codependency. And I've been doing some studying for my schooling, and I have discovered that there are some codependency issues in my life. So I have been working the recovery process and trying to overcome them. But when I had started to discover these things in my life and mention them and talk about them a little bit with my sponsor or my recovery or my accountability person, people really didn't know really what codependency was. I knew it was sabotaging my life, but there were many questions about what it was and why it was important to recognize if it was in your life as well. And so, because we can deal with it, the recovery process, just like we do our other hurts, habits, and hang-ups. So, I just want to share a little bit of information tonight on it again, and how it all ties into recovery, just to answer maybe some of those questions that are out there and give a little bit of understanding. So, the Lord willing, that's what we're going to do tonight, and share a little bit of my personal experience with it. And like I mentioned, this is a faith-based recovery group. So my information on this topic comes from a biblically based and scripturally found set of beliefs. It's not from anything that is secular, because it is quite different from secular opinions as well. So first of all, just some foundational information. And we might know this, we might not. But the Bible teaches that man is made up of three parts. We're a three-part being. We're spirit, we are soul, and we are body. And it is the man's spirit that becomes born again in that God's plan of salvation. But it is our soul that is made up of our mind and our will and our emotions. And this is that invisible part of us. It's our personality, it's our individuality, it's our history, it's our memories. And like I mentioned last week when I was teaching in Romans 12:2, that states that our minds need to be renewed if we are to know God's will for our lives. And we hear statements sometimes about finding out who we are, our identity, um, those kind of things. And this scripture points to that, not just about renewing our minds, but as we allow God to renew our minds, that we will come to know who we are. And that's very important, that we come to know who we are through the eyes of God. So, because God does care about our minds, He cares about our will, He cares about our emotions. And I remember I used to think that God only cared if I was going to be good or bad, or if I was going to be obedient or defiant, if I was going to do what was right or do what was wrong. That's all I thought He was concerned about. But I am so very glad that I found out, like Choice 2 talks to us about, that there is a God and that He cares about my hurts. He cares about my habits, and He cares about my hang-ups. But He cares about how I'm feeling about something, or He cares about my health overall, body, soul, and spirit. He really does. So, I'm glad I found out that Jesus just doesn't want me to be a good girl, and He does. But He wants me to be a happy and healthy girl too. And His will for me is the good plan. And His will and His plan for each of us is the best laid out plan we could ever imagine. And as the Bible tells us, we are formed so intricately and perfectly in our mother's womb. He designs who we were to be so many years ago, and it says that He knows every one of our days before any one of them was lived out. He already knew the things we were going to go through, the hurts we were going to go through, the things that would we get caught up in life. And He already had a plan, and He had a way for us to recover over those situations and come back to Him. And I'm very thankful for that, because He does care. I'm glad that I met a God that does care. So, but to know this plan, this good plan, we need to allow our minds to be renewed or healed. So, and this is something we cannot do on our own. We try to do it our own, but it is something we need to allow God to do. We need to allow God to do this operation in our life. And I can recognize that when I seen this scripture about the renewing of my mind, it's something that I thought I had to do. And it was just another area in my life where I realized I was trying to play the God. I was going to determine it, I was going to try to figure it out. And I still find myself trying to think my way into an answer sometimes. Or I try to find the reason that a situation is happening. And then that's when my thoughts start to deceive me, because I come to this place where, now I think I know, and then sometimes I can start to imagine the worst, and it all dovetails from there, where I have an all-out excuse to actually just continue in my poor choices. That's where my own thinking leaves me, with an absolute excuse to continue with my poor choices and just continue life on my understanding and my perspective of stuff. And sometimes we call that self-justification. We just justify why we do things, why we make the choices we make. And so it can be seen as self-justification or denial. And neither one of them is very healthy. So, I think I know something, so then I expect a certain outcome, and it doesn't turn out that way. So I get mad. And if I'm honest, which I really am trying to be, I'm mad because I thought I knew. I'm mad because I don't have the control on the outcomes, solely relying on my own mind and understanding. So I need a different perspective that will come from God and from other people who I will allow and trust to speak reality into my life in order to recover my mind to God's will and plan and identity for my life. So I know this picture here, I showed it to a few people before we started tonight. It's often used to show that our perspective defines what we actually see. And some of you may have seen this picture before used, but some people only see a young lady. And some people only see an old lady. So I showed it to our secretary downstairs, and she could not see the old lady. I pointed out exactly where her chin was, everything, and she just couldn't get it. And that was her perspective. And so if you can see it here, if you see the old lady, this is her chin, and then her big long nose, and then these are the bangs, and backwards here, and then this is all, this is her kind of kerchief or whatever. So that's the old lady. I don't know if you see it yet. But the young lady, this is her jawline, and she's looking away. She's looking this way. And this is her hair, and this is the back of her head. I don't know if you see that. But the point is, it's used to show that our perspective defines what we actually see. And sometimes what we see is not always right. The way we see things are not right sometimes. So, but if there's two people, one person can only see the young lady and one person can only see the old lady, if they can show each other and gain each other's perspective, it's like a revelation. It's like, oh, I see it. You know, you see those things all the time. The runner is it pink? Is it blue? Do you see this or do you see that? And there's something, it feels like a revelation or a shift that happens in our minds when we start to see something differently for the first time. And we see something from someone else's perspective. So, and a hidden reality becomes manifest to us. And this has happened to me many times through a process of recovery as I allowed God to renew my mind and continue to allow God that open access to the deepest parts of who I am. Sometimes we're willing to allow Him into the surface things, no problem, but the deep areas, when we allow Him there, He can really work on renewing and recovering some things. And for me, I cannot hardly believe how much stuff I had tucked away in my mental attic. That's what I call this, my mental attic. Lots of stuff up there. Usually you picture an attic with a bunch of dead cobwebs. Mine's like a very lively, active attic, mental attic sometimes. But when I started to see how certain things had affected my life, mostly being brought up in a home with a lot of alcohol issues, a lack of free expression or emotional support, I also started to see it now in my home, with my children, the way I did life, the way I was doing marriage. I see some of those things coming from my past into my present. So I was a silent carrier of the effects of codependency. And I don't know if you've ever bought a new vehicle, and say you buy a blue car, and you think, oh, not many people have a blue car, and then all of a sudden you start to see it everywhere once you get out driving it around, and you realize just how much this thing is out there, you know, how much of it is actually happening, this codependency thing. And that's when I realized, when I identified it in my past, I could now see it in my future, and then I see it everywhere. But I guess you can consider it a good thing, to see it everywhere, because you know at least you're not the only one driving that car, right? You're not the only one struggling with dysfunctional ways of living and coping. So we're never alone in these things. So, and that's the good news. It appears generation to generation and cross-culturally. It's not a respecter of persons. So it consistently destroys love and intimacy in every dimension of life. So, but once it is identified, it can be dealt with. And there is hope in recovery for codependence as well. So when you enter into a recovery process through working the choices or doing the steps, it can be seen as a progression of the work of God's Spirit and presence in our life. And we talk about that a little bit in Choice 7, Preventing Relapse. If we forget that this whole recovery process began with our surrender to let God take control. And unfortunately, I have seen it happen, and I can admit I've gone to that place myself where I feel like I have come this far, or seen somebody say, well, I have made these changes. I have been able to stay away from bad habits, or addictions, and not give God any of the credit. It shifts back to them instead of allowing them being in the position of God, rather than God staying in the position of God. But we have to realize that it is God's presence and Spirit in our life that is working in us and through us, not of ourselves. And because we tend to think of our own private lives as and trials as very personal and limited in what they are, but we actually have to see God's big picture and intent for our lives. If we give these things to Him, it can actually, I think I mentioned it last week, let this breaking of us become the making of us. So it's okay. So a few ways that when we allow the presence of God to start working in our lives, I put it into a 3-stage kind of process. Initially, when God's presence starts to come into our life, it starts to illuminate things. That's one of the very first things that start to happen. It's like a light is turned on, like I said, different perspective maybe of seeing things. We see ourselves as the ones who are trying to control everything. And we start to see God as the one who has the power to actually have our lives become manageable again. We start to see things a little bit differently. We're more open to it. A next work that the Spirit of God does, and we let Him in through recovery, is He brings revelation. I know this was a big thing for me. During this stage, God started to reveal Himself as my Father, and it was a good Father to me. He was a good Father figure, and I had a distortion of who God was. I already kind of mentioned that. So when He starts to reveal Himself to us, any distortions or false beliefs or ingrained distrust or fear or pride, rebellion, whatever it is, all of those weaknesses start to be drawn out and revealed. And for some, that's a very scary process when all those things start to come to the surface. But we have to realize it's not for us to be judged. It's for us to be restored. And so often we do not want to allow our weaknesses to come out for fear of judgment, but it is necessary for restoration. Absolutely necessary. And we cannot fear that corrective process. And one thing I go to as a reminder for myself in prayer is for God to correct me, protect me, and direct me. Because if I'm not asking Him to do those things or allowing, that means I'm trying to direct myself and I'm not allowing correction, and that I'm not protected. So protect me, direct me, correct me. And so as these things start to come out, we feel maybe a little bit embarrassed or fearful of them, but it's not for judgment. In the right realms of recovery, surrounded with the right people and the right processes, it is for restoration, and it's a safe place. So, and in that place, we start to learn and accept His deep love and mercies and tenderness towards us, and the forgiveness is beyond our understanding. I remember when me and my husband first came into church 21 years ago, and our life was at rock bottom, and I was a very shameful woman, and the choices that I had been making, and felt like a very unclean person. And we came into the back door of the church, and the pastor had already started preaching, and he was talking about the woman with an issue of blood. And because she had this medical condition, she was supposed to be quarantined or separated into some self-isolation because they didn't know if it was contagious. They didn't know what it was. But she was so desperate. She wanted to get to the feet of Jesus, and she just wanted to get into God's presence so she could be healed. And so as people seen her, they started kicking at her, spitting at her, yelling at her, you don't belong here. And that's exactly what I felt like. I felt like I didn't belong there. I was an unclean person. It wasn't a place for me to be. But there was kind of a dichotomy of things happening. All of that stuff was rising up in me. I was becoming very aware of how bad my choices were. But at the very same time, I was becoming very aware of how great his love was for me despite those things. And so that is a beautiful thing that happens. And sometimes we fear judgment from God immediately, but He's a God of grace and mercy. And I just want to encourage anyone out there to trust that process. So because we can either seek recovery or deny the depth of our need for it. And I would rather seek recovery now. I'd rather seek out that healing. So first thing was we become illuminated. We start to see things correctly. The second thing that happens is God becomes very real to us in Revelation. And then the third work of His Spirit is reigning. He begins to reign in our life. And we come to know Him as that great God, that great power that has helped us receive that right perspective in our mind. And we say that the first 3 steps or choices are about getting us out of the role of God so God could get in the role of God, and that's when good things start to happen. So that's when He begins to start to reign in our life. So wherever you're at, you may be in that illumination state where you're just starting to see things differently. Or maybe you're in that revelation stage when you're just coming to know and trust God with your walk of recovery. Or maybe you're in a stage you've experienced His power and He has healed you of some things, and He will continue to as long as He remains in your life. So, what does that all have to do with codependency? Well, codependency can be considered a disease of our soul. It's a disease of who we think we are, or maybe we don't even know who we are. But it's an identity thing. So it can be healed as we learn the truth of who we are in God. And like I said, my past life was full of terrible choices. And I had so much damage and shame when I came to give my life to God. And that was, like I said, 21 years ago. But I got saved, I got washed, I got forgiven, but I was so far from being set free. Because even though I was living a good life, and of course eventually became a pastor's wife, trying to be a good one, but even though I had stopped doing major damage to my life, I never did anything about the damage that had already occurred. And that was a very not good thing to do. I needed to go through a process of recovering, and I believe there's scriptures. I remember when I was new in church, somebody came up to me and spoke into my ear and said something that He will restore everything that the locust took away from me. And I was like, what? I don't know what she's talking about, but now I understand that. He is a God of restoration. He is a God of recovering everything that had been stolen from me and giving it back to me in such a good and better way. And the Lord wants us to be free from the damage in our life. Like I said, He's not just a God that cares about if you're going to do good or bad or all that stuff. And I'm not saying that is an issue, but He does care about those hurt areas or those unhealed areas in our life. And, the healing that can happen from God, it can happen in an instant touch. Do not deny that. But in other areas, it also has to be and happens through a process. And that's why I really believe in the necessity of Christ-centered recovery groups. Because for some, it takes a process. For me, it takes a process of recovering certain areas in my life. And God can set us free from the weaknesses and defects that have come along the way from our life, from our choices, and from society in general, from just this ugly world. And because it's really important that we are able to identify with another person and our cultural weaknesses that are out there. This is so true. Without buying into it or becoming one with it and giving it control over us. And that's what happens with codependency. We identify too much with the cultural weaknesses and we become enmeshed with them. And we'll get into that a little bit, but I'll just read that again. We must be able to identify with another person or cultural weakness without buying into it or becoming one with it and giving it control over us. And I'll let you just, that could have so many meanings today, but I'll just let that rest right there. So, in the broadest sense, codependency can be defined as an addiction to people, things, or behaviors. So it's a fallacy of trying to control interior feelings by controlling people, things, and events that are happening around us. And isn't it funny how control always rears its ugly head? Always, always. So the central issue in every aspect of life for a codependent is the degree of control they can maintain. And I was thinking about the word control. We talk about it a lot in recovery, but sometimes it's hard to identify control in your life because you feel like, oh, I'm controlling, well, I'm a control freak, or if someone has control issues, they're a control freak. But I remember we discussed a while back about the sense of control. Nobody likes to feel that things are out of control. They like to feel a sense that everything is okay. And so they use control to make sure they feel safe. So it's not necessarily a harsh monster-like control thing out of control. Sometimes it's about trying to manipulate things just to have a sense of control or a sense that everything is okay. So the codependent person can become so enmeshed with another human being that they can actually become addicted to that person. And you can become so extensively involved in another person and their life that your identity is severely restricted and crowded out by that other person's identity and their problems. Start to take on the identity of somebody else and you start to take on their problems as if they were your own. So there are severe personal boundary problems in knowing where I end and someone else begins. It's a loss of one's personal identity. So a strong image of a codependent would be like a vacuum out of control, drawing things to yourself, and not just another person, but also maybe the chemicals and behaviors that they have happening in their life. If the person likes shopping, all of a sudden you develop a love for shopping or sports or food or whatever. You take on what they love. And this struggle, we have to realize, no matter what it looks like, it's relentless, and it's to fulfill that great emotional hole or emptiness or vacuum within ourselves. That's what it is. There's such an emptiness inside that we're trying to fill it, and it's not with the right thing. So the term codependency appeared in the late 70s in the chemical addictions treatment field and was used to describe people whose lives were affected as a result of their being involved with someone who was chemically dependent. So the codependent was seen as having developed unhealthy patterns of coping with life as a reaction to someone else's drug or alcohol use. It was a reaction to being involved with someone else who had an issue. So from there we hear terms like co-alcoholic, non-alcoholic, para-alcoholic, which would describe some things like that as well. But since the late 70s, when it first started to come out, the definition of codependency has expanded greatly. And not just, like I said, not just from a secular understanding, but from a biblical understanding as well. And professionals begin to understand and understand codependency better, and seeing different types of people who appear to have to deal with it, not just those who necessarily were based around drugs and alcohol, like adult children of alcoholics, people in relationships with someone who had an emotional or mental health problems, persons in relationships with chronically ill people, parents whose children have behavioral problems, people in relationships with irresponsible people, professionals in helping occupations like nurses, social workers, counselors, pastors, other like that, any helping role. They had a tendency to deal with some codependency issues. So even recovering alcoholics and addicts had noticed that they were codependent before they became chemically dependent. And perhaps maybe some of those who became chemically dependent was for becoming codependent on an addict. So often when one relationship ends with a troubled person, we can frequently find ourselves in a relationship with another troubled person, where codependent behaviors continue to grow in that new relationship as well. And really behind it, what is going through the mind is, I don't know who I am, so I'm going to attach myself to you and hook onto who you are, if that explains it in a different way. I don't know who I am, so I'm going to attach myself to you and take on who you are. But until these behaviors or these coping mechanisms are identified and changed, these unhealthy tendencies will continue to prevail. So codependency can stem from these areas, but another more frequent factor is unwritten and silent rules that usually develop in the immediate family and set the pace for structure of your relationships. So they began back in your original family, and then my families came from their families and so on. And that's why I said when I started to look back into my past and the way I was raised, I do recognize that no matter how much I tried, I still see some of those things popping out in my family now. But now that I've identified them, I can hopefully, with the help of the Lord, stop that process from continuing. So I'm going to talk in the next couple of weeks about these unspoken rules, because this is where this whole codependency really spoke to me in what I was going through and really helped me identify, because we could read all of the definitions and all of that, kind of like I'm giving a little bit of information. But when I started to read through these unspoken rules, I want to take a little bit more time with them at another time, but I started to realize, wow, that is part of my issue. So these rules include not talking about your problems. So these are unspoken or spoken rules in families of origin. Not openly expressing feelings. No communicating honestly or directly. Unrealistic expectations about being good and being perfect. Twisted definitions about selfishness. Little openness about sexuality, and actually fun and play were discouraged because life is very serious and there's no time for fun and play. So no one is allowed to rock the boat in the delicately balanced family boat through growth or healthy change. So if somebody wants to actually become healthier, it's not allowed, as you would we're just going to do as we have always done kind of thing. So like I said, we'll kind of dissect those a little bit more and see if any of them speak to you a little bit more. So, and the thing about codependency too that I come to my understanding is that it's not like being pregnant. So all you guys don't have to worry about that. But you can't just be a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't. But with codependency, it does have a little bit of a severity. Sometimes it's not as severe with some as others. But, so, while these rules are common in alcoholic family systems, they can also operate in families where there is no active addiction. So if you're sitting in your home or wherever you are tonight and thinking, none of this can apply to me because I do not have any issues with drugs or alcohol, I came from a good home, my parents weren't alcoholics or addicts, it doesn't even have to come from there. You could have had, 2 generations ago, a grandfather who did struggle with alcohol or struggle with terminal illness, and whatever it is, it's not just subject to those around drugs and alcohol. And it may be illuminating to know that some of the things that you have accepted to cope with in life are not healthy at all. And that's where I came to. I realized that some of the things I had picked up as coping mechanisms to get through those times in dealing with alcohol in my home, that sorry, my husband just distracted me, and I asked him not to distract me because I would become completely distracted. They're not healthy. The things I wasn't healthy, and I needed to be illuminated to that. So, for me, a big thing was a misconception of selfishness. This has hugely affected me. And my husband knows this too. Maybe he feels I'm selfish. I don't know. We'll work that one out later. But to me, it was only about I only could buy secondhand stuff. And I passed it off as I'm just frugal. And I don't not want to be frugal. But really, I believe that I didn't deserve any more. Because if I actually wanted something new, I was selfish. And that's just the one of the many things where a distorted view of what selfishness was. And I would go without things because I felt like if I asked for something that I actually needed, I was a selfish person. And going back and recognizing that in my life, and I'm still dealing with that one. You would think it'd be an easy fix, but it's not. It's a process, though. And through the process, I can move from the bondage of my thoughts around what is selfishness and what is not selfish, and bond to God and receive a healthy love and a healthy identity of who I am and who I'm not, to keep going. So it's letting go of that false identity, or maybe a non-existent identity, to become a healthy, happy child of God. So it's not just about being good or bad all the time. It's about being happy and healthy, and He wants us to be happy and healthy. So why bother? I'm not perfect. Life isn't perfect, but we get through it. Storms come. We pass these things off sometimes. But if left unchecked, there are implications that come for codependence, even Christian codependence. And it is possible to be Christian and codependent. So I actually, the blue car, see it everywhere thing? Yeah, that happens. So implications are spiritual sterility. You can't produce, a life things that should be coming out of a life with God. You're sterile spiritually. You can't grow. And the inability to form intimate relationships as well. And that could be with God and with other people. Maybe you just don't feel part of something. My identity was so wrapped up in other people and my rescuing them that I was halted from finding who my true identity was in God. Because I thought that rescuing people is what I was supposed to do as a Christian person. Isn't that what He wants me to be? What He wants me to do is rescue people? Well, no, that's me being God. And we could talk about that a little bit more later. So, and consider this, I'll just leave it at this part of that. Most codependents do the wrong thing for the right reason. It's not that they're bad people. It's not that I'm a bad person. It's I'm doing the wrong thing for the right reason. I think I'm doing right. I think I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, but it's for the wrong reason. And it's because there's something missing in me, and I need to get that fixed. So other problems that can stem from codependency for Christians and non-Christians: divorce, relationship difficulties, substance abuse, compulsive behaviors that are controlling, religious addictions, which become obsessive but give no life. Our relationship with God and the church should bring life. So depression, anger beyond reason, denial of problems, and so much more. So you may not have necessarily a drug or alcohol issue to deal with, but we all still have issues to deal with. So consider this. When Jesus said, "You will know the truth and the truth will make you free," or "the truth will set you free," whichever way you want to say it, his listeners replied to him, "We have never been slaves to anyone. We are children of Abraham." They're like, we're Christian people. We're children of God. We're not enslaved to anything. And because they denied their slavery, they refused their freedom. And just like with the gospel, the bad news that we are all sinners has to precede the good news that Jesus has paid the price for us. So it's accepting the fact, and it's painful to admit problems and see the reality of our lives. It's not easy. Broken relationships, we have to admit the reality of it before we can actually receive the good news that we can recover from it. So, but in order to experience recovery and healing and break free from those debilitating patterns, we must first recognize that slavery is at the root of all of the pain in our lives. Are we a slave to hurt or a habit or a hang-up? Something is in control of our lives at all times. But the good thing is that we get to choose what it will be. If we choose right, it could be a good thing. If we choose wrong, it could be a bad thing. So when we honestly open our hearts to God and have the courage to see ourselves as He sees us, then God's power and love can begin to move in our lives in a deeper way that will begin to set us free. And we become desperate enough to face the reality of our emotions, our relationships, and our world, and entrust them to God, He will break the yoke and set us free from them. So when we choose to trust the feedback of accountability people or sponsors, those who truly want to help us in our recovery process, we discover that God has an identifiable healing and recovery process. We're not left to wonder what we have to do. And I wondered a long time what I have to do and tried many things. But there is an identifiable healing and recovery process out there. And it works if you work it. God is faithful to comfort us as well in this process. We're not alone. And to change us as we become open to having Him change us, as long as we allow Him to renew our minds and have our lives restored. So, the basics of living as a Christian requires honesty and courage. And we say that, but do we live that? Do we walk it out? I heard that the other night and I really liked it. Do we walk that out in order to learn more ways to be loving to God and to other people, healthy ways? So, healthy ways of having relationships with people, not based on the hole that's inside of us, but the fulfillment that we have received. So understanding codependency and seeking recovery help when necessary are important ways to move towards the wholeness and abundant life that Jesus offers for us. And He does have that offer for us. There's a good life on the other side of everything that we face. And sometimes it's hard to see that. It's hard to see that life could be anything else. But I know for me, I've experienced a restored life, and I'm experiencing still the process of restoration to all those things that were eaten by the worms, or whatever the scripture talks about, the canker worm or whatever it was. But he's continuously restoring little parts of my life, and it's a great process to be in. And I know that was just a little bit of information on codependency. And like I said, I'm going to break down those rules, those unspoken rules, because I believe that's where it becomes really identifiable, which of them will apply to you, and maybe which things you can take to the Lord and ask Him to search you and to help you and to hand over to Him. And He will help us recover in those areas. So I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight and joining on the group. And I'm just continuing to pray that everybody stays healthy and safe, and know that a lot of you are on my minds many times. And when I think of you, I mention you in prayer. And in the process, stay in the process, and because God is faithful if we are. Thank you all. Have a great night.